Welcome to this podcast. We are delighted to be joined by Professor Liya Palagashvili, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She is also a research fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at New York University Law. Previously, Liya was an assistant professor of economics at State University of New York Purchase, where she has taught courses on econometrics, macroeconomics, entrepreneurship, and public policy. Her research is broadly in political economy and applied public policy. Her primary areas of research are on labor and the gig economy, technology startups, and entrepreneurship. She is also interested in questions of governance and economic development, foreign aid, and institutions. Her work has been published in academic outlets such as the Journal of Legal Studies, Public Choice, Review of Development Economics, Journal of International Development, History of Political Economy, University of Chicago Legal Journal, and Journal of Institutional Economics. Liya has co-authored a book with Cambridge University Press titled as Decline and Rise of Institutions, a modern survey of the Austrian contribution to the economic analysis of institutions. She regularly engages in public writing and media activities and has published op-eds with outlets such as a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, US News and World Report, Philadelphia Inquirer, Dallas Morning News. In the year 2016, she was selected as Forbes 30 under 30 in law and policy. And she has been invited to testify with the Office of the Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. And her work has been cited by the Department of Labor, as well as in regulations published in the Federal Register. Yeah, welcome to this podcast, Liya.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. Happy to join.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for doing this. Yeah, Liya. So I kind of start by asking you your personal journey, in the sense your family migrated from Armenia, and so some background of your childhood days, as you were growing up both in Armenia and the US. And then, like what was the motivation, to do a PhD in economics? And then subsequently, why did you, go to George Mason University in particular? And then any professor there at George Mason, which sort of, left an impression on you as you began your career? Yeah, Liya.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, yeah, I grew up in Armenia, which was a Soviet country, but it was collapsing. The Soviet Union was collapsing as we were living there, and a lot of like war and poverty, and there was a lot of instability that was happening at the time, and so then we moved to the United States on basically what is called the green card lottery. So by pure luck, we got to move to the US. And my experiences in Armenia have really shaped kind of the way I see the world, because you see poverty and instability and political uncertainty and economic uncertainty firsthand. And I was always curious about why is it that in Armenia, our family and our cousins have no opportunities whatsoever, and they're not very well off, whereas we see these like vast opportunities for growth and wealth in the United States. And this has always been like an ongoing question in my head. And I discovered economics in high school when I just randomly took a political economy class. And I was so captured by it at the time because I saw it as a lens to explain these vast differences that we see in these two countries. And it really helped me understand the importance of policies and institutions in shaping the opportunities that people like myself or average people will have in those different countries. And so I loved economics from the start because it was a way of understanding the world. And you could use the tools of economics to help you explain and understand any topic that you care about. So it wasn't a subject that you had to learn about just to learn the subject. It was a tool and a lens, an analytical kind of way of thinking that helped you understand a variety of different things that you were curious about. And so for that reason, I decided to study economics. I went to George Mason University, where I I had just incredible professors there. I mean, they're inspiring teachers. They do great research. They have such wonderful programs for students and helping to capture the imagination of students. So sometimes economics in different classrooms can be really boring. And students will be like, well, I'm not interested in economics, but George Mason professors like Professor Pete Betke, John Boudreau, and we have Tyler Cowan, Alex Tabarrok, I mean, Christopher Coyne. They've just done an amazing job of helping students kind of see the beauty and the power of economics. And that has inspired me to continue to get my PhD economics at George Mason University and working with a lot of them as well.
Okay. So what is it, that sets apart the George Mason PhD program, apart from, let's say, other PhD programs? And
so the George Mason PhD program encourages you to ask interesting questions. So they want to tap into your own curiosity. So they want you to look out the window and see what's fascinating or what's an interesting puzzle. What questions do you have by looking out the window? And they provide you with a whole set of different tools for how to approach those questions. So sometimes in other PhD programs in economics, you're not kind of captured by questions. It's very mathematical, and the methodology drives you rather than questions and kind of interest rather than looking outside the window, if that makes sense. And so at George Mason, it's find the question and then think about what tools and what methodologies help you best answer and approach that question. So it might be qualitative studies, it might be surveys, it might be field work, or it might be using observational data. So we also have a lot of professors and PhD students who work on economic history. And so that's also like a fascinating field for some people as well, which doesn't come up in other PhD programs in the US at least. And so I would say that's the main difference is at George Mason University, the program and the professors encourage you to find interesting questions and kind of tap into your curiosity. And I think at other PhD programs, it's more about like learning methodology. And I've heard from, other friends of mine who are in different PhD programs mention that, the interesting questions aspect only comes much, much later. And a lot of that kind of creativity and curiosity is sometimes hammered down. And so that's a little bit unfortunate because you have students going into it who are starry-eyed and want to help understand and want to help research. And so you want to kind of encourage the curiosity rather than push it down in a way.
And so your current area of research, which is the gig economy, it's a hot topic. And so as point out in your own paper that policymakers and regulators are grappling with the growth of the independent workforce. So we will get into the specifics of those going forward. But at this stage, if I can ask you this, what are the specific features of this labor market outcomes that have the policymakers grappling with it? Liya.
So it's a fascinating aspect of the labor market. And I'll back up for 1 second and just give an overview. Sometimes in developing and emerging countries, this is called like informal work because they're not like a formal employee somewhere. And oftentimes in kind of emerging economies, this type of work is not taxed, right? It's a little bit under the table, so to speak. And so that's why it's called an informal economy sometimes, especially like I mentioned in emerging economies or developing economies. Now what's happening in the US is that like this informal market is actually becoming a bit more formal in the sense that gig work and independent work is becoming a larger part of our workforce, and it's above ground. So there's still tax policies and labor policies that impact it, and it's much more widespread right now. And so it's fascinating because we're seeing different types of contract-based work emerge for high-skilled workers, for low-skilled workers, for medium-skilled workers across the entire economy. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it is just so diverse, the workforce. So sometimes you might think about it as, okay, it's just gig workers, right? It's just drivers, or it's just nannies and babysitters, kind of like informal market.
Yeah.
But we've seen the greatest growth in the independent workforce among professional, scientific, and technical services, which is high-skilled work, right? And this is according to official, United States tax data, that professional, scientific, and technical services is the industry with the greatest number of independent contractors and has seen the greatest growth in independent contracting income since 2001, at least according to our IRS tax data. And I want to point out too that it often there coincides with kind of this rise of what people often call the creative class. This is the work of a sociologist named Richard Florida, who said you're going to have this growth of like public intellectuals and people who are in creative fields. And those people who are in creative fields will tend to do more of these independent style work. And even thinking about like Instagram influencers, or fashion or creative arts, freelance musicians, these are all independent forms of work. And so public intellectuals. And so we're also seeing that rise of kind of the creative class of individuals all working in independent work professions. And so it's far different than what we might think about when we say the word gig economy, right? Because we're thinking, oh, you're just a driver or you're a babysitter, right? But it's becoming people's like primary ways of living, and it's also capturing kind of different classes of people and different skill sets for people.
So from what I understand is, like most of the value creation that is, taking place in the technological space is happening through this landscape. Was it, gives you more flexibility, right? And so you have actually, a number of papers on this, and you've made an attempt to, aid the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in, meeting the strategic plan's fourth goal, which is producing, gold standard statistics and analysis, right? And so you've actually made like 6 suggestions in your, paper on how to improve the improvement of the how do you track this data. So why don't you sum it up, all these suggestions under one, heading, if that's possible, Liya?
Yeah, so I think the main suggestion, so right now there's a problem with how to measure this workforce, because you can be an independent worker if you drive with Uber once a month, right? And you have a full-time job elsewhere. Or you can be an independent worker by being a full-time music teacher freelancer who gets most of our income, through self-employed income. Or you can be someone who is an independent worker with one big company like Google. And so there are lots of different types of people who fit into this profile of the independent worker. And so it's quite hard to measure. This is one of the biggest problems we have in research right now. How do we measure the gig economy and the independent workforce? Who are these people? What are their numbers? What's their growth? And so one problem that we had with the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that it was measuring this workforce by including only people who were doing independent work as their primary job. So that means if you make your income, most of your income as a babysitter or as a, financial consultant who's self-employed, you would be counted in the data. But a lot of people do these jobs on the side. They're like side gigs, side jobs. And so you might have a full-time job, full-time employment job, but you might want to make more income. And so you drive with Uber in the evenings, or you babysit in the evenings. And that's not captured in the data through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So one of the most important contributions we, as a lot of myself and other economists have tried to put forth, is that how important it is to measure all workers in this field, including those who use it as supplementary forms of work. And so that was one of the main recommendations we made to the U.S. Department of Labor and to the Bureau of Labor Statistics about changing the survey for the first time to include independent workers who are also supplementary earners. And that will vastly help us get a better sense of who, how many workers these are and who they are. And just to put things in perspective, if we include kind of gig economy jobs like Ubers and babysitting and so forth, most of those jobs, according to tax data, are workers who are using it as supplemental income. And so we miss a lot of the workforce if we only measure those who do it as primary income. And so that's why it's really important to have the Bureau of Labor Statistics correctly measure the independent workforce to get a better idea of who these workers are. Because oftentimes policies are made on this data, but the data are not great. And so that's one of the reasons why I have worked with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and advised them, along with other economists, to make changes to the survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces that captures the independent workforce. And it looks like in the next version of the survey, they will actually include for the first time workers who are supplemental earners as well, so that we get a better sense of the entire workforce, so that we can make better policies about, regarding this workforce, because it's hard to, it's hard for policymakers and others to design policies if you don't have a good understanding of the workforce, and that was part of the problem.
So one thing which I wanted to ask was that is the pandemic sort of has had, obviously it has had an impact on people who want to look for other ways, such as the gig economy. What impact has it had? Do we have any evidence there?
Can you repeat the question one more time? Impact on what?
I'm saying the pandemic which lasted for like
the pandemic. Okay.
So it would have obviously had an impact on the people who are looking for other ways of earning money. So what impact has it had? Do we have any?
So during the pandemic, it was interesting. But because of the pandemic and its lockdown, jobs and labor in general fell, as we saw. But one subset of gig economy jobs increased during the pandemic, and that was delivery drivers, because a lot of people, instead of going out to eat, ordered food into their homes. And so you saw a huge influx of gig economy jobs that were deliverers. So in the US, we have this company, DoorDash, for example, or Uber Eats, and they saw a big increase in gig economy workers there, because during the pandemic, a lot of people were stuck and ordering food, so we saw that increase. But more broadly, what's fascinating that happened is that a lot of people during the pandemic got a sense of flexible job arrangements, like work from home arrangements, and they loved it. And so we actually see in some surveys that people go into more freelancing, more contract, more independent work post-pandemic. And again, it's hard to tell exactly why this has been happening, but one reason it has been happening, we think, is that there has been a greater demand for flexible job arrangements, and these independent work arrangements provide a lot of flexibility as compared to a typical employment arrangement where you have to work 9 to 5 p.m. and certain hours, hours in a year or a day or week or month. And you have to, and any flexibility you have in hours has to be agreed upon with your boss. Whereas if you're a freelancer and you're a graphic designer freelancer, let's say you have a project, you can work on that project in the middle of the night if you need to. You just, you might have a deadline with your client, but you can pick the work hours you want to work on. Maybe if you know you're going on vacation the next month, you might not take as many projects in that month as well. So it's a lot more flexible.
Yes.
And we saw that, for some of the independent work jobs, it allows you to work from home. So
Yeah.
obviously that's not the case for babysitting or driving.
Yeah.
But again, if you're a freelance writer or graphic designer, or if you have an Etsy store online,
Yeah.
and you make shirts at your house,
Yeah.
that gives you the flexibility to work from home as well. So we saw kind of an increase in the demand for flexibility post-pandemic.
Yeah.
And there is one, and that is one contribution, we think, as to why we see a growth in freelancing and independent work post-pandemic
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. So when you talk, when you mention, these terms, freelance work, contract work, consulting, right? So it's, important to, put it into proper perspective as to, what this type of, work arrangements are. So Leah, can you just explain in an objective manner, the difference between a contract work, consulting, freelance work, and this categorization is important.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
first I'll say, when I say independent work, I mean any work, any income opportunity that's outside of the formal employment arrangement. So, and independent work, I use that term because it captures all the different categories you just mentioned, like freelance, contracting, gig, consulting. So when we say independent work, again, we mean anything, any type of income activity, income generating activity, outside of the formal kind of employment arrangement where you're an employee of a particular company or organization. Now, when we use the term freelancing, that often refers to like knowledge workers or creative workers.
Yes.
Gig worker is usually workers who are on a platform, like a gig platform, like an Uber or a delivery platform. And oftentimes, one thing that differentiates freelance work with gig work is that freelancers can kind of set their own rates. So I can say, I charge you,
Okay.
$50 for one, script to a play. Whereas gig workers, they often don't get to set their own rates on the platform because the platform generates prices and rates through the algorithm. And so that's one big difference we see with freelance versus gig work. Contract work is also a category that can capture like high skilled or sometimes medium skilled workers. So we think of contract working also with individuals like electricians or plumbers, those medium skilled individuals for contract work.
Yes.
And then when we use the term consulting, it really does mean like high skilled consulting. So you're an environmental engineer consultant or a financial consultant. And so that term consulting tends to capture more of the high skilled workers. So, and then of course we also have the term like self-employed, which all individuals are all self-employed too. And I want to point out that some of these are self-employed, business owners who don't have their own employees. So you might have your own store on Etsy, right? And you're like a self-employed seller or merchant, or you might have your Amazon store. And so that also captures the independent workforce. So there's many different words that we call categories, but that's why I use independent worker, because it's a way to capture them all together. And it's a way to say these are all different types of workers who make income outside of the formal employment arrangement.
Thank you, Leah, for actually explaining it in a lot of depth as to where these differences come from. But so one natural question would be being mindful of this specific differences. They are obviously important, but where does the importance like why is it important? Like you need to be mindful of the different nature of the work that underpins each of these categories.
So from a policy standpoint, the difference between employees and independent workers are important because There's differences in tax policy and labor regulations and social insurance programs. So this is why this is a hot topic issue, in the United States right now and in other countries around the world. I mean, Europe is grappling with the same issue right now.
Okay.
The European Union has lots of different regulations and policies they're looking at for the gig economy.
Okay.
But the reason is because if you're an employee, you're subject to minimum wage rules, overtime wages, a lot of labor regulations. But if
Yeah.
you're an independent worker, you're not subject to those. There's also things like social insurance programs, like unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits. Employees have access to unemployment benefits, but independent workers do not. In the United States, we have health insurance tied to an employee, but not tied to an independent worker. So
Okay.
it creates this dynamic where you have one set of workers, employees, who have, who are under lots of labor regulations and have a lot of access to social insurance programs, and
Okay.
another set of workers, independent workers, who are these freelancers, gig workers, contract workers, and so forth, who aren't under any labor regulations and who don't have any access to social insurance programs, solely because of the design of our institutions in this way, because we created only two types of workers, and we said one type of worker, employee, gets everything, and the other type of worker, independent worker, gets nothing, and is not subject to any regulations. And so that creates a lot of policy kind of tensions that are happening right now at the federal level in the US and also at the state level. And as I mentioned, it's an issue many different countries are grappling with as well. Now, there's another difference between this group of people and my colleague and I, we decided to look into to understand whether there are real economic differences between these two type of workers. And so we used a theoretical framework in economics called transaction cost economics.
And
it helped us, we basically empirically tested whether there are real differences between independent workers and employees based on this framework. And so the framework more or less says that we should expect that workers who are employees have greater team production and coordination, and kind of it's more difficult to separate contributions to output if you're an employee. Versus independent workers tend to have more defined contributions and output. So it's like you're producing one thing, a screenplay. I can measure that, right? And there's less what's called interdependent team production in independent work versus traditional employees. And so we hand collected, we basically found every single gig economy platform in the United States, and we looked for every single job that was available on those platforms. And then we used a Department of Labor sponsored database that has basically all of the around 900 jobs, I should say, and all of them have like different work characteristics of those jobs. And the work characteristics might say something like, this job requires a lot of team production. This job requires that you coordinate a lot with different employees. This job requires a lot of communication with different workers. And we actually we found empirically that independent workers do tend to have more defined contributions to output. And they're less team production dependent, right? That's more about you're producing one thing, a ride, right? You go from A to B, or a screenplay. Whereas workers who are employees tend to have greater interdependent team production, and coordination is really, really important. And that helps us kind of see that there might be real economic differences between these type of workers, rather in addition to policy differences as well. And so that was a really important finding, because again, it kind of helps us see the uniqueness of this type of work. And it helps us understand what type of jobs might be more amenable to be independent contracting jobs or independent work jobs rather than employment jobs.
So, thank you, Liya, for, mentioning about, the paper that you wrote with, I think, Paola Suarez, that, looked
Yes,
into.
that's the paper we have. It's called A Framework for Understanding Work Differences.
So are these, evidences consistent for the high level, value created, jobs, or are they uniformly distributed across high scale, low scale, medium scale?
So
This,
we tested it across all independent work jobs,
okay,
across all, and we didn't have a differentiating point between low skilled and high skilled jobs.
okay,
It was across all independent, contracting jobs.
okay, okay. So Leo, why don't you tell us about, like what we know so far in terms of, the composition of, this workforce in the US, um, the data, that is available for this so far
Mhm.
on, how many
Um,
independent workers are currently operating in the US, United States.
yeah, so that's a great question. I would just like to point out too, there's a lot of different ways of measuring this workforce. There's, official government survey data. There's surveys from different research firms and consulting groups. And then there's also administrative data. And I would say the best is the a set of tax records data that's not publicly available. It's actually private data.
From the IRS.
And yeah, the tax records data.
Yeah.
And so that one kind of gives us the best sense of what the what this workforce looks like. So I'll tell you a little bit about those findings, but again, I should note that there's like 20 different papers and data sources on the independent workforce that might have different conclusions and findings.
Okay.
But I'll highlight the ones using the IRS tax records, just because there's a lot of problems with surveys, as we know, and those tax records tend to give us a better sense of, I think at least a better sense of what's going on. So, first of all, one of the things that we get from the tax records, which I had mentioned earlier, is that less than 10% of the overall independent worker, independent contractor workforce is in the gig economy. So that includes companies like Lyft, Uber, and DoorDash.
Yeah.
So in fact, those workers on gig economy platforms are only about 8.6% of the overall independent contractor workforce.
Okay.
Now, in addition to that gig economy workforce, that growth in it has been driven almost entirely by workers whose primary income comes from traditional, employment jobs, and then who supplement that income with this platform gig economy work. And the tax data also indicate that independent contracting is most prevalent among high-skilled workers who already have a full-time job. So again, it would be someone who is a high-skilled worker who is a full-time employee somewhere, and then they consult on the side, for example. So we see the greatest prevalence of independent contracting among those, like high-skilled earners who have a full-time job elsewhere, who are using this as a side job. Now, the other thing that we get from the 1099, from the tax data, is that independent contracting is more prevalent among men rather than women, but that the participation in independent work since 2001 has grown significantly more among women.
Okay.
And since 2001, women have seen a 68% increase in independent work, and men have seen about a 37% increase. I'd also mention some industry breakdown. So from the tax data, we see that the greatest industries with independent contracting income is professional, technical, and scientific, followed by healthcare. So again, it's a very different picture than kind of the transportation world that we might see. But it gives us a big, a greater perspective on what's actually happening in the overall independent work, arrangements in the US.
Yeah. Thank you, Leah. So, you mentioned that, this, women have actually seen the greatest, growth in terms of their participation. And so we know that, women self-select into independent work roles where greater autonomy defines, the work. So, where the role, allows for greater freedom to make decisions and structure, activities. And so this is where, Professor Claudia Golden has a lot of research, on this. So why don't you tell more about this, Leah?
Yes, so Claudia Golden's work, she's a labor economist at Harvard, has highlighted essentially just how much women value flexibility in the workforce, and they often have to pay for this flexibility in some sense in terms of a lower wage. And she talked about this in a lot of the traditional workforce arrangements. So like if you're a lawyer, or in other kind of more employment arrangements. And we wanted to extend kind of this discussion into women in independent work arrangements, because flexible job arrangements and flexible work is a staple feature of independent work. And these flexible job arrangements, can be especially transformative for working women who are primary caregivers. And that's what we're finding in a lot of research studies that do look at independent work and flexibility in women. So, for example, there was a recent study that shows that self-employment rates are higher for women who have young children, and that self-employed female workers seem to have more flexibility in their work location, hours, and schedules as compared to women in traditional employments. And studies have found that mothers with young children at home use self-employment opportunities to spend an additional 2 hours per day with their children. And in a sense, these kind of self-employment independent work opportunities give mothers more control over their work environment, allowing them to better manage their household while working. And by the way, again, back to the tax data, one of the tax data research also shows that female independent workers are more likely to have children than are female employees. We also have a lot of survey evidence and survey data that looked at women in independent, as independent workers. So, for example, there was one study that found that it was 2,000 women, right, that they surveyed, and they found that 96% of those women indicated that the primary benefit of engaging in independent work is the flexible working hours. And then 70% of those women were the primary caregivers in their home. And they also found that a quarter of those women recently left their full-time employment jobs to do platform-based or independent work. And the majority of them indicated that they did that because they just needed more flexibility or needed more time to care for a child, parent, or relative.
Yeah.
And so I guess to sum up, we are seeing a lot more women in these independent work arrangements. That's why we've seen a growth of women in independent work arrangements as well, because it seems like women are using these independent work arrangements as a way to women who are primary caregivers, I should say. So women who are primary caregivers are using these independent work arrangements as a way to care for the kids and to make income at the same time, because you might have a harder time doing that if you have a full-time W-2 job that might be more inflexible about work hours. And, what happens if the daycare or their school closes, right? And you would have to ask off for that day, and maybe you can ask off last minute. And then it also allows more flexible work hours in terms of picking up kids from school and so forth. And so anyway, and I think it's really fascinating and an important area of research that I'm working on, and others as well, looking at how these flexible job arrangements and the independent workforce can be particularly transformative for working mothers.
But from the recent rule statements that have been passed in number of states, flexibility is not being taken well by the states such as California, correct? they want to reclassify these independent workers into traditional, employees.
Yeah, so we've
Yeah.
seen a lot of policies on the state, and also a little movement on the federal level as well, trying to make it more difficult legally to be an independent worker. And so the way that these policymakers see the situation is that they think these are bad jobs. So that's one of the motivations that they essentially say, like, these aren't good jobs and we need society to have good jobs.
But the evidence is actually the contrary. Most of the value creation that is happening in high tech technology are happening through this domain, right? That's the evidence.
Yeah, that's right. And actually that was another, we didn't get into this, but I did a survey at NYU where we surveyed over 500 technology CEOs across the US, and we asked them about different how they started their company, different aspects of their company. And one of the things that they mentioned is they almost always worked with independent contractors early on because they need the flexibility to hire and fire early on, because the product might change, the idea might change. And so you almost never hire an employee when you're a startup. You kind of work with contractors until you have something, and then maybe until you're a formal company, and then you can kind of have a long-term promise of a long-term contract as an employee. And so these sort of work relationships, independent work, short-term flexible contracts are just so vital for startups, especially technology startups. And it was one of the surprising findings we found in the survey, because we weren't expecting so many executives and CEOs to say how important it was to have contractors, independent contractors, independent workers in the early stages of the company. And so again, if you had to hire someone only as an employee right away, you wouldn't be able to do it and still get your company off the ground. You need that like ability and flexibility to hire and fire and pivot the business model completely one direction or the other in the early stages of the business. And these flexible labor supply, flexible work arrangements allow you to kind of do that in the early days. And then of course, as the company becomes more established and grows, that's when they hire full-time employees, because those are more about like a long-term contract with one particular worker, and the conditions in which the environment and so forth are more stable. So it makes sense to hire someone who's more full-time and so forth there.
So but why don't the regulators get this point?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So why don't the regulators in the US at the federal level understand this point? They want to reclassify them as traditional employees, right? So they want to make sure that they receive the health insurance or other benefits.
Exactly. So the motivation is that, look, the more jobs become independent work jobs, that means more and more workers will not have health insurance, they won't have an unemployment insurance, and they won't be under minimum wage and other types of labor regulations. And so the idea is to make it more difficult for people and for companies to work with independent contractors by changing the legal definition of what it means to be an independent contractor. And again, the goal is to try to get more and more workers, at least that's their stated goal. Like, they want them to have good jobs and they want them to have good benefits with the jobs. And so that's why they try to regulate it in this way. Obviously, as is the case with many policies, we don't get the intention that we want with the regulation. And so in fact, what happened in California was that there was a major backlash, especially from like freelance professions, freelance musicians, freelance writers, freelance editors and translators, all pushed back against this rule. And they actually asked for exemption because they saw basically job losses across the entire state when California implemented the stricter definition of independent contractor, because companies cannot extend all of their contracting positions into employment positions. And then and then with the rule, it also made it illegal to have those contracting positions. So for example, if you're a photographer and one of your clients is a company, and maybe you work with that company 10 hours a month total, right? Let's say you have 15 other clients. All of a sudden, the California law is saying, hold on, you can't contract with this photographer. You have to hire them full time as an employee or part time as an employee. And the company's thinking, well, I only work with them 10 hours a week. You know, the photographer also says, I have like 15 different clients. This company is, one client. That employment relationship doesn't make sense. And then also the contracting relationship is effectively outlawed. And so as a result, you have all of these contracting jobs that are eliminated because of state law. And so that's why there was such a big backlash against the California law. It essentially has been a failure. A lot of people who, before the law passed, they were very vocal supporters of the law. They completely died out after. It didn't say a word about it after, because a lot of newspapers, even like New York Times and Los Angeles Times, have highlighted all of these editors and freelance musicians and others who've lost their jobs, contracting jobs, and who didn't get employment jobs, most of the time because they don't want to be employees as well, as a result of the rule. And that has led to, that has kind of caused the law to be seen across the United States as unsuccessful, but nonetheless, we still have new laws that are emerging at the federal level.
Utah
Said.
State of Utah actually has opened the road for companies to provide benefits to independent workers, right?
So that's one of the work that I've been doing as well. Excuse me. That's a little bit of the work I've been doing as well, which is thinking about other policy solutions that might be helpful for independent workers. And so the other policy solution is, how do we alter the institutional and policy framework for benefits? Because right now it's not illegal, I should say. It is much more difficult for companies to provide benefits to independent contractors than it is to provide benefits to employees. So if a company were to provide benefits to independent workers, the IRS and other government agencies and state agencies can say, oh, you provided benefits to an independent worker. They look like, that means they're an employee. We're going to reclassify the entire workforce as employee. So it essentially punishes and discourages companies from providing benefits to independent contractors if they want voluntarily. So what Utah just did is they passed a law that said, if companies are going to provide benefits to independent contractors, that can't be used against them in these worker classification issues. And they just passed this in March. It was just this past March. So it would be really interesting to see kind of what emerges in Utah after. One problem, of course, is that some companies might still be scared to provide benefits to independent contractors in Utah because of the way that our IRS and Department of Labor operate, which means that if you have a company that has independent contractors in Utah and other states, they still, basically the Utah law doesn't help that company. So they'll still be subject to IRS and Department of Labor regulations. And so it's a little bit uncertain about what the outcome might look like. But let's see. I think there's some optimism about what the Utah law means. There's other states that might pick up this rule as well, because it's a way to help independent contractors without harming the workforce.
I mean, so the basic idea is, you are cognizant of the specific situation, and so you're making it better for them to be able to participate in their whatever capacity that they want to, right? So Liya, one last question which I have here is that, so what are the parallels, if any, for emerging market economies, such as India? Because you see, technology now makes it possible for you to collaborating with anyone, like, we are doing, you are sitting in, New York or wherever you are. I am in India, right? So any implications, does it have? Because outsourcing is going to, like happen from companies located in the US to let's say in Europe or India or other, emerging countries. So any thoughts here, Leah?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. Fiverr or Upwork, both of those
Yeah,
platforms are
yeah,
freelancing platforms.
yeah,
I have used them to get help for a variety of different things, like creating a scraping script and so forth.
yeah, yeah,
Almost everyone I have used has been in an emerging economy. So
yeah,
some from India even, and it's so fascinating. It really expands that, like it really expands like where the work is coming from.
yeah,
And so I've worked with many different people from India using using Fiverr and
yeah,
Upwork, and it's great for workers in emerging economies because it gives them a source of income that's outside of their boundaries, right? Like their country boundaries. And so
yeah,
you can have a software developer in India providing tons of independent contracting and independent work for a customer base in America or in Europe or whatever,
yeah,
anywhere else
yeah,
around the world. And so I think it has vastly expanded the work opportunities for people. I should say income opportunities for people
yeah,
in these emerging and developing economies.
yeah,
And I think it'll continue to do so as we see kind of, in economic terms, fall in transaction costs
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and more of these peer-to-peer platforms emerge, especially in what's called like crowd-based work, which means that you don't have to be there to do it in person, right? So you
yeah,
can provide me with a script working from home or in your own country or so forth, without having to provide the service in person, like driving.
yeah.
But I think it'll be a bit important factor in growth of this labor market and emerging economies in the years ahead.
Yeah. So the onus is actually on, let's say, workers here in India to, make sure that their skill levels are, like they're working on themselves to be able to, take up, work if, they have,
Yeah,
yeah, yes,
I think as they continue, I mean, in India, very highly educated populations, as they
yeah,
continue to build up their skills. And as I've said, I work with so many people on through Fiverr, and Upwork in India,
yeah,
providing these services. And so I think it'll continue to grow as a source of income for people in emerging economies like in India. I
yeah,
also think it's as technological sectors grow, and as I shared with my research, that especially for startups and tech
mm-hmm.
startups,
Yeah,
it's essential that a lot of these workers are independent workers, contract based.
mm-hmm.
And so as that sector grows both in India and elsewhere in the US where we can outsource some of the work,
Mm-hmm.
that it'll continue. Yeah, as that grows, I think it'll again continue to be important for India, and especially a lot of the high skilled workers there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's where, we can actually capitalize our human capital, and
Exactly. Yes.
yes,
Yes. And it's just fascinating to me because again, I'm coming from Soviet Union,
yeah,
19
yeah, yeah,
Armenia,
yeah,
where
yeah,
like you wouldn't,
yeah.
and back in the day to pre all of these platforms, you wouldn't
Yes,
have these sort of work opportunities available
yes,
to
yes,
you.
yes,
Whereas now you could be living in, rural Armenia, but still be able, if
yes,
you can, you know, if you have the right level and right amount of skills, you can get
yes,
work opportunities outside of your country.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Any other last point, Leah, that you might want to?
No, I think that covers it. I think it's an important and growing sector of the labor market, both in the US, and I think it'll be important in emerging economies as well, especially as the independent workforce and these peer-to-peer platforms grow. It'll
Yeah,
provide income and work opportunities for people around the world.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank
Leah.
you so much.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I thoroughly enjoy, the conversation and, the research that, currently, doing and the areas of research that you have lined up in front of you in terms of the gig economy. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Liya. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.